Today, I would like to talk to you a little bit about impossible change. In sub-Saharan Africa, 1 in 8 children dies before their first birthday. Around the world, 30 million people are living with HIV or AIDS. Globally, more than 100 million women are estimated to be missing. And this is a soft way of essentially referring to the gender bias in mortality that is driven by sex-selective abortion, female infanticide, and generally inferior care that is given to girls. India alone accounts for 50 million of these. I could go on, but instead, I want to pause for a minute and do a quick exercise. I want you to take a moment to think of a really big social issue that pains you, that really affects you, that really hurts you. Just take a second. Now, I'd like a show of hands, okay? How many of you genuinely believe that you yourself could fundamentally impact or eradicate that issue within your own lifetime? Okay, there's a few tentative hands, which is probably about right. Most of us believe that these problems are too big and too complicated to be solved on any time frame, let alone our own lifetimes. But what if I told you that this might be more possible than you think? You see, the interesting thing about the human brain is that if it doesn't understand something, it typically thinks that it's impossible. People are really comfortable working hard at things that they know how to do, but they often get paralyzed when they are faced with tasks that they don't understand at all. Take the Rubik's Cube, for example. You're all familiar with the Rubik's Cube. Yeah. See, the thing is, most of us know that it is possible to solve them, right? But it really only takes a couple of attempts for the vast majority, essentially, to decide that there must be some kind of magic going on, and it's just beyond our ability to do anything with it. But the funny thing is that there are some people that can solve these in under 10 seconds. There are guys out there who can do it with one hand. So, the thing is, it's not that complicated for them because they understand what they're doing. And just like the Rubik's Cube, the reality is that solving these apparently really big, complicated social challenges is also actually doable, as long as you understand the mechanics and the dynamics behind those challenges, and you're willing to put the time in to get that understanding. Why don't we do this more often? Well, the reality is that understanding the problem takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort. We live in a world of ideas and instant gratification. We're looking for magic bullets and quick fixes. We're not geared towards putting the kind of effort required for grunt work and legwork. We're looking for excitement. We're looking for solutions. The result, essentially, is that we build solutions typically based on assumption. And while that kind of gets us close enough to make some kind of difference, it's usually not enough for us to fundamentally dismantle those big problems, even on a local scale. Fortunately, the reality is that if all it takes to understand the issue is two things. You need to investigate the problem, and you need to immerse yourself in it. By investigate, I mean primary and secondary research, looking at a theory, understanding the best practice. Immersing yourself in it is the more interesting piece. It's about making it part of your life experience. But if you haven't gotten out of the coalface, you haven't worked with people, you haven't lived with them, it's very difficult for you to understand the real dynamics of what happens in those environments. So once again, you're back to having to work on assumptions. A good example of this is a book called The Corner. If any of you have watched The Wire, then you'll know what I'm talking about. This book was written by a guy called David Simon and a colleague called Ed Burns. And it's quite an amazing book because it really gives you an understanding of what it takes to understand problems. These guys, they spent years writing this book. It chronicles the life of poverty on the drug-addled streets. and corners of West Baltimore in the United States. Yeah? By the time the book was published, David Simon had been immersed in that reality for 13 years. The book is essentially an observation. There's very few pages in it where they actually give their own opinion. But when they do give their own opinion, it is amazingly insightful. You really get the feeling that these guys have understood all the dynamics involved behind the issue over there, and that if they chose to actually do something about that problem, the solutions that they would come up with are really likely to work. So the thing is that if you are serious about solving these problems, the first building block of success is whether or not you're in it for the long run. If you are, then really all you need is three things. You need a solution that works, you need an organization that can deliver it effectively, and you need a way to reach everyone who needs it. And actually all three are built upon the same building block, and that is an understanding of the problem. I'd like to use an example of an organization that I've personally worked with in Chile, called Rodelillo, to illustrate this. So they have a solution that works. Their solution is built on the life experience of the lady that founded it. And their vision is to transition people out of poverty. I don't mean, a little bit of extra income. I mean, really make a difference. So they're looking at ownership of housing, their children going to university, families completely transitioning out of poverty. There's a complete break in the cycle of these issues. They have an organization that can deliver it effectively. And over 25 years, with 35 staff and an army of volunteers, they've impacted 35,000 families with an over 90% success rate of transitioning out of poverty, in the kind of way that I'm talking about. And it's actually quite amazing when you think about it. And you have to ask yourself the question, if they can do it, why aren't we seeing this more regularly? The trouble is that we tend to start with ideas rather than starting from the problem. Because ideas is kind of what excites us. Ideas is what gets us motivated. We're able to get behind them. And ideas are often based upon solutions that we're already familiar with. So effectively what's happening is that we are designing solutions based on solutions, or starting from solutions, rather than starting from understanding the issue itself. And then we kind of fit them to whatever it is we understand of the problem that we're trying to deal with. So, the fact that people start with the solution instead of understanding the problem kind of gives us an issue, which is that they start with solutions, mission, vision, strategies, but they don't start with the problem itself. And what happens then is that you don't have clarity of vision, because your vision is what the problem should look like when it's fixed. So a classic kind of vision that you get is when people say things like a world where every child has access to an education that matters, or receives an education that matters. Now, the question is, why? And what does matters even mean? Effectively, all you've said is that you have a world where everybody's receiving a strategy. Actually, say you had a vision that was every child is free from persecution. That would be a better vision. But then you still have the problem of saying, well, what does persecution mean? Does it mean, freedom from child abuse? Does it mean freedom from bullying? Does it mean violence, harassment? And when you look at that, the question is, where do you draw the line? What's the difference between, harmless teasing and full-scale bullying or full-scale harassment? So the point I'm trying to make is that you really need detail and clarity before, with your vision, before you can even design effective solutions. If you don't do that, what happens is that your solutions effectively don't go anywhere. They're not based on any longer-term outcome. It's like the Hall of Famer Yogi Berra once said, if you don't know where you're going, you might end up someplace else. And this is actually one of the big challenges that we face. You see, so the reality is that everything linked to solution design is based on the same platform. And that platform, as I've mentioned before, is problem definition. Yeah. So here's a framework that I use to show how everything links together. Now, I'm not going to go through it in detail, but you can see that all the elements actually sit upon the same basic building block. If you want to know more, there's a video on YouTube that'll take you through it. But, I just wanted to kind of make the point that all the way through to organizational design, your roadmaps for scaling, everything is built on the same block. And if we're designing solutions that don't start from this point, we have very little hope of actually tackling these massive issues. The other interesting thing about looking at the problem definition and starting from that perspective is that instead of complicating the issue, it often makes it a lot simpler. So if we use, for example, MAD, this is the organization Make a Difference that I currently work with. See, we've kind of learned this the hard way. We understand the experience of children pretty well, but what we don't know is what happens to them when they become adults. Nobody really knows. Nobody's tracking this data because it's really difficult. If you want to find somebody that's in the age group of 35 or above, and you want to know kind of where are they today, there's no email addresses, there's no phone numbers, there's no databases that you can just access and go find these people. So, what we're realizing is that without a clear understanding of that piece, we have no idea today if any of the interventions we're putting in place are actually going to make any difference in the long run. So what we've got at the moment is teams of people, researchers, going out on the ground and essentially looking for people in these age demographics. It's just brute legwork. And then when we find them, it's not as simple as just turning up and saying, hey, tell me about your life. You have to immerse yourself in that. You have to build the relationships with them. So just the action of trying to find out what's happened to children that grew up in shelters is going to take us years. But, the thing is that what we're finding is really interesting. Before we started, it kind of felt like the assumptions when we looked at, what we thought was happening. It's a huge number of different characteristics, so many different aspects that we need to worry about. It was almost overwhelming. But then, as we understand the situation better, you realize that it all kind of boils down to a few kind of root issues. And in this case, it's actually really just two. It's the child's ability to cope and flourish in the real world when they leave the shelter, and it's the impact of institutions that affect the child. And when you look at those two, again, you see that there's really only a certain number of interventions in each part of that. On the empowering child aspect, which is the first strategy that we end up employing, you have kind of 5 pieces. You look at the emotional health of the child, you need to look at the life skills that the child has, you look at the education, and by that I mean knowledge as well as technical qualifications. You need to look at their readiness for work, things that we take for granted. Actually, if you haven't grown up in those working environments, you're familiar with them, it's really not that easy to get jobs, to hold jobs, to maintain them. And then finally, there's aftercare. And this one is the least intuitive of the lot. The other ones are kind of things you think, yeah, we know about that one. Aftercare, actually, if you think about yourselves, put yourselves in your real life scenario, you're in your 20s, mid-20s, late 20s, you're actually still reasonably dependent on your families for support. And we kind of take that for granted. You don't have families, you don't have support systems. That whole support system is very, very important if you want to ensure that people end up as stable adults. And the goal for us in this context, when we look at the vision, we look at outcomes, what we're looking at is, lives that are free from exploitation as your bare minimum, and from the literacy and kind of empowerment side. And on the financial side, it's the ability to cope with life crisis. That's our minimum goal. When we look at the environment that the child is in, we again have about 5 different intervention points. You've got the shelter that provides the basic needs of the child. You've got schools, you've got the family, you've got the state, and you've got society. And the interesting thing is that when you look at these intervention points, you look at these 2 ways of addressing human development, it's very applicable to pretty much any kind of work dealing with children at risk. It's just that the emphasis changes a little bit. If you're working with, marginalized children in rural environments that have families, then you don't need to worry about, the emotional health to the same level as you might have to if you're working with children in shelters that are orphaned, that have no connection with their families anymore. or even worse, children that are being trafficked, and are facing that kind of trauma. The same goes for, how much emphasis you put on the state's involvement. For us, it's a longer term exercise of looking at policy, looking at how, if we wanted to reach the 20 million children that are living in shelters today, we're going to have to influence government at some point, because we realistically cannot scale up, the 1-to-2 ratio of volunteer to child that we have right now. So the thing is, for us, it's kind of a choice that we have to make. Either we decide that we fundamentally want to impact this problem, and if we do so, we have to think about it as a long-term exercise. We need to look at it, and we do, on a 15 to 25-year time frame at a minimum. So, the point, I guess, in the end is that it'll take a long time. But as we understand the problem, what we're realizing is that it is doable, to the point where we genuinely believe that it is doable. So, see, the truth is that if someone had told me 17 years ago, when I started out as a volunteer teaching inner city children, to prepare for their final exams in school, that one day I'd be in a situation where I'm seriously designing for and planning to tackle, a massive issue, a big social issue faced by 20 million children in India, I'd have told you that you were crazy. But after years of working around the world, working with projects on the ground, I've started to build an understanding of these domains in a way that it no longer seems so difficult. It actually, on a general scale, honestly feels doable to me. And this is what I hope you'll take away from this talk. I hope you think again of the challenges that you considered earlier, and maybe recognize that if you're willing to put the time in, they are things that you personally could do something about. So, again, I firmly believe that it is possible to do something about these big social challenges to the point of even eradicating them. It won't be easy, but it certainly isn't impossible.